except I left the microphone on the other side of the room.
First mistake Robbie's made Is that good enough right there?
Yeah, we'll just move the chair. Okay, that was embarrassing.
Okay. All right. Now get me going again.
All right, yeah, you're going. It's live.
Good evening and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible lesson here at Fellowship Baptist Church. We want, first of all, to kind of let you know where the project stands in the auditorium. So I think we have a live photo. No work going on in there tonight, but there is a picture of where we're at. They tell me they will have the upholstering done by Friday. Looking at it, I don't know. I hope they're right. If they do not finish the upholstering by Friday, I did ask them to make sure they got the center section done, which will be more than enough for our reduced crowds on Sunday morning inside. So, but that's where we stand, and once the pews are all reupholstered, then the following week the plan was, I suppose it still is, the plan will be to begin the carpeting the first of the week. So, just so let you know, it's going to look a little different for many of you, well, for everybody to begin with, and eventually, as people come back, things are going to look a lot better in the auditorium, and we're thankful for the Lord's goodness enabling us to do that, and those that have contributed to the project, we're very thankful for all that had a part in it. So let's get now back into our Bible lesson for tonight. And we are in the 11th chapter of the book of Revelation, chapter 11. So be sure and get your Bibles and notepads out. Get set to take a few notes here tonight as we look at chapter 11. This is lesson 12, I think, on the screen, but it'll be chapter 11. That's right, the book of Revelation, lesson 12. Okay. Now remember, chapter 11 is part of this parenthetical section between the seven trumpets and the seven bowls of wrath. And the chart we've been using here depicts the seven seals in the beginning of the book of Revelation, or the beginning of the tribulation period. Chapter 6, verses 1 to 17. The seventh seal actually is the seven trumpets, but before the seven trumpets are commented on in our text, we have that parenthetical section in chapter 7, which just covers general events and circumstances that's not necessarily pinpointed as to where it is in the book of Revelation as far as the timeline or the chronology is concerned. Then we went into chapter 8 and we began to look at the seven trumpet judgments. And of course, the seventh trumpet will be actually the seven bowls of wrath. So we are in between now the seven trumpets and the seven bowls of wrath. And I don't know if we'll get all the way finished with chapter 11 this week, or as far as I want to go. So I'm not sure if it'll be next week. If not, it'll be in 2 weeks. We'll begin to look at the seven bowls of wrath. But right now we're in that section in between, the parenthetical section, which is chapters 10 and 11. So in chapter 10, we had the revelation here of the angel who had the little scroll or the little book, and we went into that last week. And now in chapter 11, John's witness of what's going on in heaven as he is observing these things comes to what we call the measuring of the temple and the two witnesses. Now here's where I'm not 100% sure I'm going to get into the two witnesses tonight, but we might. I think not, though. So we're going to look at the first part of chapter 11, the first couple of verses, and we've got a lot to talk about here, and this has to do with the measuring of the temple. So if you're reading along, and I'm reading from the New Schofield version of the King James translation, and there was given me, remember John speaking here, John writing, there was given me a reed like a rod, and the angel stood saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship in it. But the court which is outside the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the nations, and the holy city shall be tread under foot 42 months. Okay, the measuring of the temple. Now, it is in reality more than just the temple that is measured. Okay, if you notice that in verse 1. The temple is measured, the altar, and them that worship in it. So, what John saw by way of vision, sometimes we just don't know how to describe it. He saw it. Of course, it hadn't come to pass yet, but he saw it prophetically in the future. This measuring takes place with a reed like a rod, a measuring stick. I just think of a yardstick. You pull out a yardstick, you got 3 feet. Now, what was the measure? We don't know. And we're not told what the measurements are. But there is a measuring that is taking place here. And actually, John sees the temple, the altar, and the people, and he is told to do the measuring. And the best we can probably ascertain from this is that the measuring of the temple seems to indicate God's ownership, the fact that it belongs to God in some special way. And some have compared it to surveying a piece of property, ascertaining exactly what the outside, lines or property lines of a piece of property would be, especially if it is bought or sold. In a deed, you'd have to have those measurements and so on. And you only survey a piece of property that you're going to buy, or else I suppose someone could hire anybody to survey for them. But the surveying takes place as a part of ascertaining exactly what is possessed. So it seems that the measuring of the temple here indicates God's ownership, and that then would help us to understand why the temple is measured along with the altar and the people that worship in it. The thing that does stand out here now when you read this, and here's a depiction of Solomon's temple, the first temple. Solomon, of course, the son of David, was given the task of building the temple. David wanted to, but he was prohibited from doing so. The job fell to his son Solomon, and it was a marvelous and glorious piece of architecture, place of worship. And I don't believe that anything since really rivaled it. Even though Herod, tried to do a great job as far as architecture is concerned. But Solomon's temple was the first one. Of course, Solomon's temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians when they took the southern kingdom of Judah captive. Remember, the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, were taken by the Assyrians, I think around 722 BC. Nebuchadnezzar came in, besieged Jerusalem, and destroyed Jerusalem and took captives around 586, I believe, BC. And that temple was, Solomon's temple was destroyed. Now the Jews were in captivity for 70 years, and they were allowed to come back, first under the leadership of Zerubbabel, the political leader, or the governmental leader, and Ezra, who was a priest, the religious leader. And the temple was, of course, the focus of their coming back. The temple was rebuilt. And if you remember, the old men, when it was finished, stood around and cried, and the young men shouted for joy. And the reason is the young men never saw Solomon's temple. So to them, this was a great and wonderful thing. Although in comparison to Solomon's temple, it was, it just was much less ornate and beautiful and all the rest. So the second temple then, built in the days of Ezra. Then when we come down to the life of the Lord Jesus Christ and the four Gospels and the accounts we have there of the temple, it seems as though what we have there is still the temple that was built in the days of Ezra, but it's been made, it's got a makeover, a refurbishing, if you will. And this was primarily done by King Herod. Herod was half Jewish, and he was ruling for the Romans in this particular area of the empire. And Herod was a great builder. He loved to build buildings and all those types of things, anything that would stand out and be remarkable. And the Jewish temple was renovated in a big way during the days of King Herod. That's the temple that was there still when Jesus was born and when Jesus died, and the veil in the temple was rent in two. So that was temple number 2. Now the third temple, because the temple that Herod refurbished goes back to the days of Ezra, that was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans, who besieged Jerusalem, and eventually under the Roman general Titus came in and destroyed the city and the temple. And you remember Jesus himself said in advance prophetically when he was on earth that there would not be one stone in that temple left standing, and literally that's what happened. It was set on fire, and the gold overlay melted and ran down in the cracks and the crevices of the stones, and the Roman soldiers literally pried apart and tore apart each and every stone to try to obtain the gold. So that came to pass in AD 70, and of course the Jews retreated east, a remnant of them, to Masada, where they made their last stand. Now, so that's 2 temples. The third one is the one we read about right here. And it's just mentioned, bang, right here, chapter 11, verse 1. We haven't really heard anything about it, but here it is. And there was given me a reed like a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship in it. So, well, there's been no record here in the book of Revelation as to the rebuilding of this third temple. Now, we do know that the Jewish people that are very orthodox, and they're still looking for the Messiah, and that's just a portion of the Jewish people, because there's all sorts of various religious groups within Judaism today. But the most conservative, the most fundamental of those groups, they are, I think they're referred to as the Hasidic Jews, and they have plans for the rebuilding of this third temple. And a lot of work is being done to obtain all that's needed to construct it, but it's not yet been built. But we do know that come the tribulation period, there it is. So we can move on then to number 2 here under A, the remarkable, or it is remarkable that the temple stands rebuilt during the tribulation period. Verse 1. So the question comes, well, when is the temple rebuilt? What are the circumstances of the temple being rebuilt? And I'm not sure what I put on this next slide. Let me look at here. Yeah, here we go. Under this heading number 2, we have the A and the B, the little a and the AB, little b. Note here that some have wrongly concluded that the rebuilding of the temple is done prior to the tribulation period. Now, although that is entirely possible, there's nothing that says that the temple cannot be constructed until after the tribulation period. It could be built anytime. But it's not stated in Scripture anywhere that it will be rebuilt prior to the tribulation period. Although it is possible that the rebuilding of the temple will begin prior to the tribulation period, it's unlikely. And I say it's unlikely for good reason, and we'll get to that in a minute. B, it's perfectly reasonable, though, to assume that the temple will be rebuilt sometime during the first half of the tribulation period, since the only scriptural requirement is that it be in place by the halfway point when it is desecrated by the Antichrist. Now let's go back to the book of Daniel and note what Daniel said about this in Daniel 9 and verse 27. Backing up to verse 26, and we covered this in the 70 weeks prophecy earlier. Verse 26 of Daniel 9, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. So after 69 weeks, Messiah is cut off. Christ is crucified. Then after that, the prince of the people, or the people of the prince that shall come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, that's what was done by the Romans in AD 70 that I mentioned just a little earlier. And then it talks about, in verse 27, that there's going to be a covenant that takes place, some future point. And the he here is the prince that's mentioned in verse 26, the previous verse. And we understand that to be the Antichrist. And we haven't learned much about him yet in our study of Revelation, but he will be studied in short order here in a few weeks. And that Antichrist, it says, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Well, that last 1 week is the 70th week of Daniel's 70-week prophecy, and that is the tribulation period. And of course, there's a big gap between 69 and 70. The 69th week ran out in Jesus' day, shortly before he was crucified, and then there's not been a 70th week. But that 70th week will come about as a result of some sort of covenant or some sort of treaty that will take place. And so it says that he, the Antichrist, shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week, halfway through that last 7 years, which would be 3.5 years in, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. He'll stop the animal sacrifice the Jews will be carrying on at that time there. And he'll do that, why? For the overspreading of the abomination. He shall make it desolate even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So what is this desolation that takes place in the temple 3.5 years into the tribulation period? Well, we have to go to the book of Matthew chapter 24 for a little bit more information. Jesus here speaking in the Olivet Discourse says in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, after already discussing things that take place in the first part of the tribulation period, says in verse 15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand it. And then he says, let him who are in Judea flee and into the mountains, and so on. The abomination of desolation. Well, going over to the 13th chapter of Revelation now, we add to it what we're going to come to here in a week or so. In verse 8 of chapter 13, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him whose names are not written in the Lamb's Book of Life. So the Antichrist, who's the subject of chapter 13, will literally set himself up to be God. In fact, there's a reference I failed to write down. We can look up here and put with ease, and that would be in 2 Thessalonians. We'll get there in a second. 2 Thessalonians. I do this every time. I forget this one. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan with all powers and signs and lying wonders, it says in verse 9 of chapter 2. He will be a liar, a deceiver. Where's the verse I'm looking for? I may have to call on Robbie, my walking reference over here to my right, to find the verse I'm looking for here. But he declares himself to be God, and I may be too early in the book or too late here somewhere. But anyway, maybe he'll find that for us here in a minute, and I can go on so you're not forced to have to sit there and look at me in stone silence as I thumb through the Bible trying to figure out where that one I didn't write down is. But anyway, the Antichrist will declare himself to be God and set himself up to be worshipped, as we learn is going to happen from that last reference in Revelation 13:8. That is the abomination. That this man, the Antichrist, who is the emissary of Satan himself, sets him up to be worshipped in place of God. And that goes all the way back to what we know about Lucifer, when Lucifer, way back in the Old Testament, we're told, desired to be like God. That verse is chapter 2, verse 4 of 2 Thessalonians. Who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Or, of course, he's not, but he declares himself. Thank you, Robbie. In addition to all of his technological expertise, he's also a wise student of the Bible and a good assistant. Thank you. Okay, so let's move back to the book of Revelation, chapter 11 again. And we're noting here that the only thing that's required scripturally then is for the temple to be in place at this juncture, 3.5 years in, to the tribulation period. And that leaves 3.5 years for that temple to be built, if it's not built or started prior to the tribulation. And it's certainly reasonable with modern construction expertise that temple could be built within that 3.5 year period. So there's nothing requires that it have to be happened. Although if they start on it tomorrow, I'm going to be looking for the Lord to return soon. But his coming would still be imminent, because we don't know how, if it started or built before the tribulation, how long it might be there before the Lord comes back. Okay, let's move on to our next slide here. John is instructed to measure the outer court, or excuse me, not to measure the outer court of the temple in verse 2. Notice verse 2, but the court which is outside the temple leave out, and measure it not. And the reason is given. It says, for it is given unto the nations, or the Gentiles, the nations is the same word in the Greek, given to the nations, that the holy city shall be tread underfoot 40 and 2 months. That's 3.5 years. So the abomination of desolation takes place 3.5 years in, and then for the last 3.5 years, Satan, through the work of the Antichrist and the Gentiles, they are basically ruling the world, and of course that won't last very long before the Lord comes back and puts an end to that. But John is told not to measure the outer court of the temple. Now, the outer court of the temple was the only part of the temple, when we go back to the last one that was there, Herod's temple, it was the only part of the temple that a Gentile could occupy. The problem is, today, the site of the temple, and there's nothing there. It's just where the temple once stood. It's just flat there on the Temple Mount. But within, a short piece from where that temple actually stood, there is the Muslim shrine, the Dome of the Rock. And of course, the theory has been, and I think it's right to understand, if the Jews decided to rebuild the temple and they were at the same time going to demolish the Dome of the Rock, which is sacred to the Muslim religion, there would be all-out war over that. So the fact that the Dome of the Rock there is standing in the vicinity of the temple is an obstacle to the building of the temple. And yet, the reality is that the Antichrist is going to come up with a solution to that covenant that he makes, that he eventually violates on his own 3.5 years in. But the covenant he makes satisfies the Jews and the Muslims, and then somehow or another the temple is constructed without, evidently major warfare of any kind. Now, you say, well, how could he possibly do that? Well, one way, I think, to understand the possibility of this whole thing is to understand that the Dome of the Rock does not stand on the site of the temple proper, but it stands in what would have been, back in the days of Herod's temple, the outer court, which is where the Gentiles were allowed to come to worship God anyway. Or at least they were allowed access there. Whether they came to worship or not, they could have entered in and been in that outer court. Now, with that thought in mind, I want to give you a little bit more here by way of illustration. There is a picture of the Dome of the Rock, the golden domed building which sits on the Temple Mount. The picture is taken from the south, looking back across the Kidron Valley from the Mount of Olives. So it's kind of far away. Now, I visited the Temple Mount, and I was there. People were going into the Dome of the Rock, and they make you take off your shoes, the Muslim, before you can go in, but they don't let anybody go in. And so I took off my shoes and went in, and I immediately was confronted by some sort of Muslim prophet casting all sorts of curses toward me and all other Christians, and it was very uncomfortable. I stayed very, very briefly and got out of there. Supposedly the sacred site of the Muslims and so forth. And yet there's nothing there but a rock, the highest point on the Temple Mount. And supposedly, in their faith, Muhammad descended back to heaven from there or whatever. We also know that Muhammad died. So, but anyway, that is thought to be an obstacle to the rebuilding of the temple. Now, here is a depiction of Herod's temple back in the days of Jesus. And the center section there where you see the temple proper, that contains the holy place and the Holy of Holies. It contains the brazen altar on the outside. It contains the court of the men, or the court of Israel, and then the court of the women, and finally the court of the Gentiles. Now, I want to illustrate this for you by a series of arrows. So let's put up an X first. Here, where the X is and I don't know exactly, but somewhere in here that the Dome of the Rock stands. So you can see that it is in that outer court of the original temple. So it's not over where the temple was, the temple proper. So now let's go to an artist's chart here, or rendering that has a lot of things on it. You can see about everything on here. You see the main temple up at the top, in the middle. The most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, being the furthest back, the holy place, where only the priests could go in front of that. And then outside of that, inside that little white area there, is where the altar, the brazen altar stands, that little yellow square. And then the court of Israel, outside of that, where the men of Israel could come and bring the sacrifice. And then on outside of that, back to the lower part of the picture, that huge area where the court of the women, Jewish men and women could come there. And then outside of that, you see to the left, it says the Gentiles' court, or the temple courtyard. Now I'll put some arrows up here just to make sure you understand what I'm saying. I'm superimposing my own arrows here. So there's the court of the men, represented by the M, also called the court of Israel on the chart. Going one more, here's the court of the women, represented by the W. And then we have the court of the Gentiles, represented by the G, which spreads all the way around both sides and in front of the temple area, back around the front of the court of the women and on the other side. Now, keep in mind all of that, and you see the X down to the left-hand corner where the Dome of the Rock would probably be located in that area. So there's plenty of room for the temple to be rebuilt where it was originally and not interfere with the Dome of the Rock. If there's some sort of agreement or covenant, that something that takes place like that, or who knows, there could be some sort of military strike or war or something that destroys the Dome of the Rock. Who knows? We don't know. But we do know the temple will be back in its place during the tribulation period. All right, let's see what we got next here. Okay. We're down to the two witnesses, and I think I'm going to probably wait and hold off on this till next week, because we've got enough to think about here. The sacrifices will be reinstituted by the Jewish people. The temple will be in place. The Antichrist will desecrate it 3.5 years in, and he will require the world to worship him from this newly constructed temple. That's the third temple. We had Solomon's temple from the days of Ezra that Herod renovated. This will be the third temple, and it will probably be destroyed before the tribulations is all said and done. There'll be a fourth temple constructed according to Old Testament prophecy that will be there in the millennium, or the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And there's two views on that. Some think it'll just be this one that'll survive, and others think it'll be another one that'll be built. So that's how you hear first, second, third, fourth temple referred to, Bible scholars and so on. Well, that will be enough for tonight. Next week we'll talk about the two witnesses, and this is getting interesting. It's getting down to what's taking place in the world today. By the way, we know, in Israel at this moment, I mean, the Temple Mount is contested. I mean, it was put underneath of Arab control by way of a treaty a number of years ago. Sometimes there's clashes there between the Arabs and the Palestinians and the Jewish people. By the way, just so you know, because you probably hear about this, we can go back here. Here we go. Give me a bigger picture of that, Robbie. On the back side of this depiction, there's a wall. The wall that goes around it that gives us the outer court. The back side of that wall, down over behind it is a portion of the stones that comprise that back wall, the Temple Mount, and possibly the temple structure itself. And it's kind of in a lower, it kind of drops off elevation-wise back there. And on the back side is what's known as the Wailing Wall, where Jews go, Hasidic Jews will go and lean up against and touch the Wailing Wall and pray and looking for the Messiah to come, not knowing that he already has come. So that's an interesting point. A nice place to visit as well and see that. Okay, well, we have here in this book, the book of Revelation, the history of the world written in advance. We know what's going to happen. We know how it's going to happen. Now, there's many things that Revelation talks about. We don't know exactly everything or understand it all completely, but we do know plenty, and Christ will be victorious. Satan will be defeated, cast into the bottomless pit for 1,000 years before he's finally destroyed or cast into the lake of fire for eternal destruction. So God will be victorious. God's children, as we know, we will reign with him. And so that's a joyous thought. And it's a thought that should bring us great comfort in these days because, you know, the world's a mess. And the world's getting worse morally, governmentally, financially. I mean, think about it. Even the environment, we got this particular coronavirus thing. I mean, there's nothing that's secure in this world. And yet, because we know the Lord Jesus Christ, we are absolutely secure in him. And our future and eternity is settled. So we rejoice and thank God for that. And that's a great comfort to us. Well, please be praying that we will perhaps see an end to this viral contagion that we're still dealing with to a degree. It's not as bad as it has been, and hopefully we'll continue to see improvement. Pray for our country. Pray for our leaders. We are commanded to do that in Scripture. At the same time, be faithful in serving God and worshiping God. And we want you all to understand we are providing multiple options for you to worship together. Now, sometimes that means, you know, obviously all times right now, there's a certain portion of you that are not gathering here where the church is, and that's perfectly all right. Everybody is and should be responsible for their own health and well-being, and you know your situation, circumstances, and we realize many are not going to be able to be here with us. But we're worshiping together by means of the live stream. Some come in automobiles, sit in the automobiles, and then others are gathering on the lawn, and then we have probably we're averaging around 40 probably on the inside right now. We've got plenty of room to scatter out. We can handle up to 90, between 90 and 100 in the auditorium, and still maintain a 6-foot social distancing rule. So we got a ways to go, but if we get up to that point, I mean, it looks like we're going to go above it, then we would have to go to 2 services. But it's just the way things may unfold going forward. So keep all these things in mind and pray about them. Pray for me and for the church staff and for the deacons and everybody that's involved in leadership, Sunday school teachers who are faithfully working by way of the Zoom app. By the way, I just found out, I've been saying we have 2 adult classes. We've got 3 adult classes actually meeting by way of Zoom. So that's a joy to know that that's going on. And well, just God bless each of you. Thank you for being faithful to the broadcasts. And who knows, maybe in a little while we'll be able to meet in person on Wednesday night as well. But we'll see how that goes. God bless you. We'll see you next week. And in person, maybe some of you before that. So God bless each of you. Bye-bye.